On a quiet afternoon in a small, peaceful town, Tasha, a young pregnant woman, was walking home from her doctor's appointment. She had been taking her time, enjoying the warmth of the sun and the breeze, unaware that this day would soon take an unexpected turn. The town, usually calm and welcoming, was going about its normal routine. But for Tasha, everything was about to change. As she walked down a quiet street, her mind focused on the upcoming months of pregnancy and the excitement of becoming a mother, she noticed a police car slowly pull up beside her. The car stopped, and the officer inside, a man named Officer Smith, rolled down his window and called out to her. Tasha, a bit confused, stopped and looked over at him, unsure of why he had stopped her. "Excuse me," Officer Smith said, his voice sharp. "What's your name? Where are you going?" Tasha, surprised by the question, looked at him with a hint of uncertainty. "I'm just walking home," she replied politely. "I'm fine, thank you." Officer Smith, however, didn't seem satisfied with her response. "I asked for your name," he repeated, his tone now more demanding. "Show me some ID." Tasha, who had never been in trouble with the law, didn't understand why the officer was treating her this way. She had done nothing wrong. Her heart began to race, and she instinctively placed a hand on her belly, making sure everything was okay with her baby. "I'm just going home," she said again, hoping this would end the conversation. But Officer Smith wasn't having it. He got out of his car and walked toward her, blocking her path. "Listen," he said, looking her up and down. "I need to check your ID. You're acting suspicious." Tasha's confusion grew. She had never felt this kind of pressure from a law enforcement officer before. She wasn't sure what to do, and her mind began to race. The officer was already making assumptions about her based on her appearance, and it was making her uncomfortable. She had heard stories about unfair treatment from police, but never thought she would be in that situation. "Why are you doing this?" Tasha asked, her voice trembling slightly. She wasn't trying to be rude, but she had no idea why this officer was singling her out. She had every right to be on this street, but Officer Smith didn't seem to agree. "Just give me your ID," the officer snapped, now getting more impatient. Tasha stepped back, feeling more nervous with each passing second. Her heart was racing, and she could feel the weight of the situation starting to press down on her. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, being treated like a criminal for simply walking down the street. She tried to reason with him one last time. "I'm pregnant. I just need to go home. Please." But the officer's expression remained cold. Instead of listening to her plea, he stepped closer, his demeanor becoming more aggressive. Tasha's hands clenched at her sides, her body stiffening in defense. She could feel the unease in the air, and it was only getting worse. It was in that moment, when Tasha had no idea how this would end, that something in her shifted. She couldn't back down now. Not for herself, not for her baby. She would not be bullied. But just as she prepared to speak again, Officer Smith's actions took a shocking turn. The officer raised his hand, and without any warning, he punched Tasha in the stomach, knocking the wind out of her and sending her stumbling backward. Her hand instinctively shot to her belly, her heart leaping in panic. Everything felt like it happened in slow motion, and Tasha's world spun as she tried to keep her balance. The pain was sharp, but the fear was worse. Would her baby be okay? Was she hurt? Would this officer's aggression destroy the safety she had been working so hard to protect? Tasha gasped, her hand clutching her stomach in shock and pain. Her body trembled from the force of the punch, and for a moment, she was unable to move. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had never imagined a situation like this in her worst nightmares. The officer, who moments ago had been just a man doing his job, now seemed like a stranger, someone completely unrecognizable. He stood there, still with an angry expression, as though he hadn't just crossed a line. Tasha struggled to regain her balance, her knees wobbling beneath her. The pain in her abdomen was sharp, but it was the fear that made it worse. She couldn't remember ever feeling so vulnerable. Her pregnancy was the most precious thing in her life right now, and this officer's aggression made her fear for the safety of her unborn child. With a shaky breath, Tasha forced herself to stand up straighter. She couldn't let this officer's actions make her crumble. She had to stay strong. Her baby needed her. Around them, people started to notice the commotion. A few pedestrians, who had been walking down the street, turned their heads at the sound of Tasha's stumble. It didn't take long for them to realize what had just happened. A couple of people stepped closer, their eyes wide with disbelief. They were witnesses to this unsettling scene, and Tasha felt a strange sense of hope. Maybe someone would step in and help her. "Are you okay?" a woman asked, her voice concerned as she reached Tasha's side. Tasha nodded weakly, though her body was still shaking, and she couldn't bring herself to speak for a moment. But then, as if on cue, the voices of a few other onlookers began to rise in anger. "What's going on here?" One man shouted. "What are you doing to her?" Tasha didn't have the strength to say anything just yet, but the crowd's response was enough to stir Officer Smith from his cold stance. He looked around at the people gathering around, his face turning red with frustration. But despite his obvious irritation, he didn't make a move. Something about the growing crowd made him hesitate. "Officer," a man shouted, stepping forward. "What are you doing? You can't just hit someone like that." Tasha, still clutching her belly, felt the anger in the crowd rise. They were starting to call him out, questioning his actions. The officer's hand, which had been raised in what seemed like a reflex of power, lowered slightly, but his eyes remained locked on Tasha. She saw his confusion, his anger turning into a sort of nervous tension. The woman beside Tasha, who had come to her aid, stood firm. "You can't treat her like that. She's pregnant," she said, her voice filled with righteous indignation. "She didn't do anything wrong." Officer Smith didn't respond immediately. He was now looking around at the people gathering, at the growing crowd that was starting to voice its disapproval. His posture, once confident and demanding, now seemed less sure. He shuffled his feet uncomfortably and glanced away, as though realizing the full weight of what he had done. He knew he had made a mistake, but he wasn't yet willing to fully admit it. Tasha felt her breath catch in her throat. The pain in her stomach hadn't subsided, but now she focused on something else. She knew that the crowd wasn't just there to witness the moment. It was there to demand justice. The voices grew louder, and she felt a strange surge of power. She wasn't alone in this. The people around her were taking her side, and they were standing up to the officer. "Leave her alone," shouted another person from the back of the crowd. For the first time since the incident began, Officer Smith stepped back. He seemed to freeze in place, his face pale as the realization hit him. He looked down at Tasha, whose hand was still protectively on her belly. His expression softened, and Tasha could see the first signs of guilt flicker across his face. But it was too late. Tasha, despite her shaking hands in fear, knew she had to say something. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. She gathered her breath and turned to the officer, her voice clear and steady, though her body still trembled. "You don't know who I am, do you?" she asked, her tone calm, but full of meaning. It was a question that would change everything. Officer Smith didn't respond, but Tasha could see the hint of confusion in his eyes. The silence stretched between them, and the crowd watched, waiting for her next words. Tasha stood tall, though her body was still trembling from the pain of the punch and the tension of the situation. The crowd around her had grown, and every eye was on her and the officer, waiting to see what would happen next. The moment was heavy with anticipation. Officer Smith, still standing in front of her, seemed unsure of what to do next. His face was a mix of anger, confusion, and guilt, but he hadn't moved. The people around him, the witnesses to this unjust action, were waiting for him to explain himself. Tasha, her hand still resting protectively on her stomach, stared directly at the officer. She knew the crowd would continue to speak up on her behalf, but she had to take control of the moment. This wasn't just about her. It was about making sure that something like this didn't happen to anyone else. "I'm the daughter of Mayor Leonard Thompson," she said, her voice firm but calm. "You've just hit the daughter of someone who's worked his entire life to make sure everyone in this town is treated with respect. My father has fought for equality and fairness. You can't just do this." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, it seemed like everything had stopped. Officer Smith blinked, his eyes widening as the reality of who she was set in. Tasha's words were like a sudden shift in the atmosphere, breaking through the tension and making it clear that there was more at play here than just a random encounter. The mayor, her father, was well known in the town for his dedication to civil rights and justice. He had a reputation that commanded respect. And now, Tasha's identity had completely changed the dynamic of the situation. For a few long seconds, Officer Smith said nothing. His jaw clenched as if he was trying to process what Tasha had just revealed. His eyes darted around the crowd, now fully aware that they had all witnessed his actions, and the fact that Tasha was the daughter of the mayor made everything even worse. There was no easy way out for him now. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some people were now speaking out more confidently, while others stood back, waiting to see how the officer would react. The tension was palpable, and Officer Smith's face flushed with a mixture of frustration and regret. His body language betrayed his discomfort. Tasha could see it. He was no longer the confident, aggressive officer who had punched her just moments ago. The power dynamic had shifted, and now he was standing on shaky ground. As the crowd continued to murmur, Tasha stood firm, refusing to back down. She had done nothing wrong, and she would not let this officer's mistake define her day, her future, or her reputation. Despite the fear she had felt earlier, now there was a growing sense of strength within her. Her father had always taught her to stand up for what was right, and she wasn't going to let this moment pass without holding the officer accountable. The officer took a step back, his gaze still locked on Tasha, but now there was a trace of fear in his eyes. He glanced at the people around him, noticing that the support for Tasha was growing by the second. They were watching him closely, expecting him to make the right choice, to apologize, to make amends. But instead of an apology, Officer Smith began to stammer, his words coming out in a jumble. I didn't know," he said, his voice shaky, almost apologetic, but it lacked sincerity. The crowd wasn't fooled. Tasha took a deep breath and shook her head slightly. "You should have known," she said, her voice steady, her eyes never leaving his. "You don't treat people like that. You don't hurt someone just because you feel like it." The crowd around them grew bolder now, shouting their disapproval. They had seen enough. This was no longer just about Tasha. This was about everyone who had ever faced unfair treatment. It was about standing up and making sure that actions like this didn't go unchecked. Officer Smith stepped back again, his face a mix of regret and anger. He could feel the weight of the moment. He had made a mistake, and there was no easy way to fix it. The crowd was no longer on his side, and Tasha wasn't backing down. He had failed as a public servant, and now there was nothing left for him to do but stand there, exposed in front of everyone. Tasha's heart still raced, but she felt stronger now. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had the truth on her side, and she had a community behind her, ready to stand up for what was right. The officer had made a mistake, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. The moment hung in the air, and Tasha could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. Her heart was still racing, her breath shaky from the initial shock of the officer's aggression. But now she felt a strange sense of calm. She had spoken her truth, and with it, she had shifted the power. Officer Smith seemed to realize that too, his face flushed, and his eyes darting nervously around the crowd. The tension that had once been thick with anger now simmered with uncertainty. Tasha's words had done more than just reveal her identity. They had put everything into perspective. She wasn't just a random woman walking down the street. She was someone with a voice, someone whose father had dedicated his life to justice and fairness. The officer had crossed a line, and the public knew it. The crowd was no longer silent. Their disapproval grew louder with every passing second, and Officer Smith knew he had no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. Tasha took a slow, steady breath, making sure to stay calm. She was not going to let this man intimidate her. "You don't know who I am, do you?" she had asked. And now, in the silence that followed, the weight of her words was sinking in for everyone involved. Officer Smith shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking back to Tasha. For the first time, he seemed less sure of himself. The anger that had been so evident when he had confronted her had now turned into a nervous energy. His fingers twitched at his side, as if he was unsure what to do with them. Tasha could see his struggle, but she wasn't going to let him off the hook. She wasn't going to let him twist the narrative. This wasn't just about the punch. It wasn't just about her being a pregnant woman who had been treated unfairly. It was about the systemic issues that had allowed this kind of behavior to continue unchecked. "I'm the daughter of Mayor Leonard Thompson," she repeated, her voice unwavering. "My father has spent his life fighting for equality and justice. He wouldn't stand for this, and neither will I." The officer's face paled as Tasha's words hit home. Mayor Leonard Thompson was not only a well-respected figure in their town, he was known for his relentless fight for civil rights. He had brought attention to many important issues, including the need for better treatment of people of all races and backgrounds. The thought of crossing the mayor's family, especially his daughter, made the officer rethink everything. He had not just hit any random person. He had assaulted someone who was connected to a powerful movement for justice. The crowd, sensing that the officer was beginning to crumble, grew louder in their support for Tasha. Some people shouted at him, demanding he apologize. Others stood silently, watching with a mix of anger and disbelief. Tasha felt the eyes of the town on her, but this time it was different. The eyes were filled with support, ready to see justice done. Officer Smith took a step back, his hand raised as though to ward off the crowd. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice faltering. But the damage had already been done. His apology, if it could even be called that, wasn't enough. He had acted on his biases, and now he was facing the consequences of his actions. Tasha's voice was calm, but firm. "It doesn't matter if you knew or not. You still hurt me, and you still treated me like I was less than human. That's not something you can undo with an apology." Her words were measured, each one landing with purpose. She was done being the victim. She was done being silent. She was ready to stand up, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. The officer's shoulders slumped. He had no excuses. He had made a choice, and now he was exposed. The crowd wasn't backing down. Tasha wasn't backing down. And in that moment, she felt a sense of empowerment she had never known before. She wasn't just a woman on the street anymore. She was a symbol of strength, a symbol of the fight for justice that was far bigger than any single person. As the crowd continued to voice their disapproval, Tasha took another deep breath. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. She had made her stand. She had made it clear that actions like this couldn't be ignored. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake. This was about standing up for what was right, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it might be. The officer, once confident and aggressive, now seemed smaller, as though the weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. And Tasha, standing there with her head held high, knew that she had won the moment. Tasha stood still, her heart still racing, but her mind sharp, clear, and focused. The crowd around her had only grown larger as more people gathered to witness the unfolding drama. Officer Smith, who moments ago had acted with such aggression, now seemed deflated, his earlier confidence completely gone. It was clear to everyone around that Tasha's revelation had struck a powerful chord, and now the situation had taken on a whole new energy. She had revealed who she was, and with it had turned the tables on the officer who had dared to lay a hand on her. The officer stood in front of her, his face now pale, and his hands were trembling ever so slightly. The crowd's disapproving murmurs grew louder. the anger and frustration palpable in the air. It was like the tension had reached its peak, and everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The officer's gaze flicked between Tasha and the people around them. He looked uncomfortable, trapped in the very situation he had created. Tasha didn't say a word, but her presence spoke volumes. She wasn't looking for an apology. She wasn't interested in hearing the officer try to explain away what he had done. No, what she wanted now was accountability. She had learned from her father, Mayor Leonard Thompson, that the fight for justice was about more than words. It was about actions, and this officer had to answer for his. "I'm not looking for your apology," Tasha said, breaking the silence with calm authority. Her voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the firmness behind her words. "I don't need you to say you're sorry. I need you to understand that what you did was wrong, and you need to take responsibility for it." The crowd was silent for a moment, and then a few people nodded in agreement. It was clear that Tasha wasn't going to back down. She wasn't seeking sympathy, just respect. Respect for herself, for her family, and for the community she was a part of. And the people around her respected that. They saw her strength, her courage, and they were ready to support her. Officer Smith shifted on his feet, his eyes dropping to the ground. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The crowd's eyes were on him, some filled with anger, others with disbelief, but all expecting something more from him. It wasn't just a matter of his personal mistakes. It was about how his actions reflected on the institution he represented. The officer cleared his throat, but his voice came out weaker than he intended. "I didn't mean for things to get out of hand," he started, but the words felt hollow. The sincerity was missing. It wasn't enough to undo what had already been done. The crowd wasn't buying it. Tasha shook her head slightly, her expression still calm but firm. "It's too late for excuses," she said, her voice unwavering. "You made a choice when you decided to treat me like that. And now, it's time for you to face the consequences." As she spoke, Tasha realized that it wasn't just the officer who needed to understand the impact of his actions. The crowd around her needed to see that standing up against injustice wasn't always easy, but it was always necessary. This moment wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had ever been mistreated or overlooked. Tasha wasn't afraid. She had never been afraid to speak out, to challenge the wrongs in the world. And now, as the officer fumbled with his words, she could see the shift happening, not just in him, but in everyone around them. The crowd's discontent was now focused, their collective anger turning into a force that demanded change. "You'll have to face what you've done," Tasha continued. "You'll have to answer for it, and you'll have to prove that this won't happen again, not just to me, but to everyone who's ever been mistreated by someone in your position." There was a deep silence, the kind that settles over a room when everyone knows that a moment of change has arrived. Officer Smith didn't know how to respond, but the weight of the situation was settling in. He was being called to account for his actions, and it wasn't something he could walk away from. Tasha's eyes never left his. She wasn't looking for vengeance. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was simply standing up for what was right, and in that moment, she had become a beacon of strength, inspiring those around her to do the same. As the crowd began to disperse, Tasha turned and slowly walked away, her steps measured and confident. She knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The officer's actions would have consequences, and the town would have to reckon with the reality of what had just happened. But Tasha had done her part. She had stood up for herself, for her unborn child, and for the truth, and that was enough. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of the crowd continuing to talk, voices filled with both anger and hope. Tasha didn't need to look back. She had made her stand, and it was clear that the fight for justice was far from over. "You'll have to face what you've done," Tasha continued. "You'll have to answer for it, and you'll have to prove that this won't happen again, not just to me, but to everyone who's ever been mistreated by someone in your position." There was a deep silence, the kind that settles over a room when everyone knows that a moment of change has arrived. Officer Smith didn't know how to respond, but the weight of the situation was settling in. He was being called to account for his actions, and it wasn't something he could walk away from. Tasha's eyes never left his. She wasn't looking for vengeance. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was simply standing up for what was right, and in that moment, she had become a beacon of strength, inspiring those around her to do the same. As the crowd began to disperse, Tasha turned and slowly walked away, her steps measured and confident. She knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The officer's actions would have consequences, and the town would have to reckon with the reality of what had just happened. But Tasha had done her part. She had stood up for herself, for her unborn child, and for the truth. And that was enough. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of the crowd continuing to talk, voices filled with both anger and hope. Tasha didn't need to look back. She had made her stand, and it was clear that the fight for justice was far from over. Tasha walked away from the scene, her heart still pounding in her chest, but her steps now a little lighter. The crowd that had gathered around her continued to murmur, some voices louder than others. She could hear snippets of their conversation as she made her way down the street, the words justice and accountability standing out. She hadn't expected this reaction, but she was grateful for it. It was more than just a crowd of people. It felt like the entire community was rallying behind her, and that gave her strength. The incident with Officer Smith had shaken her to the core, but now, as the tension in her body slowly began to ease, she realized something important. She had taken control of her own story. She had chosen not to remain silent, not to allow the injustice to go unchecked. And that felt powerful. As she continued walking, Tasha reflected on everything that had just happened. Officer Smith's initial aggression had caught her off guard, but she had responded with clarity, with truth. Her father's teachings echoed in her mind. Always stand up for what is right, no matter how difficult it seems. She wasn't just defending herself. She was defending everyone who had ever been unfairly treated or looked down upon. She passed by the small park near her street and stopped for a moment, letting the cool breeze wash over her. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting a soft golden light across the trees. It was a peaceful moment, a brief escape from the chaos of earlier, but she knew that what had happened would continue to echo throughout the town. Tasha's phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She pulled it out and saw that she had received several messages. One was from her father, Mayor Leonard Thompson. She couldn't help but smile as she read it. "Are you okay? I just heard what happened. I'm proud of you. Let's talk when you get home." She quickly typed a response, letting him know she was fine and that she'd be home soon. Her father's words meant the world to her, and she knew he had always been there for her, guiding her in moments like these. His support was one of the many reasons she was able to stand up so strongly today. As she pocketed her phone, she glanced around at the street, noticing that it was starting to clear out. The crowd had dispersed, but the incident had left its mark. Tasha wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew the town wouldn't forget what had happened. The conversation had already started, and it was a conversation that needed to happen. It wasn't just about one officer's bad decision. It was about the way people, especially people of color, were often treated by those who were supposed to protect them. Tasha took a deep breath and continued walking home. She knew that tomorrow would bring more questions, more attention, and possibly even more tension. But she was ready for whatever came next. She had faced her fears and had done what she knew was right. And she knew that if she kept standing tall, the change she hoped for could begin here, with this moment. When she got home, her father was already waiting for her. He had called the press office to make a statement about the incident, and the phone lines had been buzzing all afternoon. As she walked through the front door, he gave her a reassuring hug, his arms strong around her. "You did well," he said quietly, his voice full of pride. Tasha leaned into the embrace, feeling safe in his presence. "I just did what was right." Her father nodded, pulling back to look at her. "I know, and that's what matters most." They spent the rest of the evening talking about what had happened, about the officer, about the town, and about the steps that needed to be taken next. There was a lot of work to do, but Tasha knew that this was just the beginning. Change wasn't going to happen overnight, but every step, every voice raised in support, would add to the momentum. And as the evening wore on, Tasha felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had done something today that many people might have been afraid to do. She had stood up, and in doing so, she had sparked a conversation that needed to be heard. It wasn't over yet, but she knew this was the first step towards something better. Tomorrow would come with its challenges, but Tasha was no longer the woman she had been earlier that day. She had found her voice, and she was ready to keep speaking out, no matter what. The next morning, Tasha woke up early, as the bright light filtered in through the window. Her body still felt the lingering effects of yesterday's events. The adrenaline had worn off, and now her muscles ached from the tension. She had barely slept the night before, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. The conversation with her father had been comforting, but it hadn't calmed the whirlwind inside her. She knew that the situation wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. After a quick breakfast, she got dressed, choosing something simple but comfortable. Her mind was already busy with thoughts of what she would do next. She wasn't sure how the town would react now that the story had broken. The press had already picked it up, and Tasha had received calls from local news outlets asking for interviews. She wasn't sure if she was ready for all of that, but she knew her voice mattered. She had to speak up, not just for herself, but for the people who felt powerless in situations like the one she had just gone through. As she walked down the stairs to leave the house, her phone buzzed again. It was a text from one of her friends, asking how she was doing. "Thinking of you. You did something amazing yesterday." The message read. Tasha smiled at the words. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, but the support from her friends and family had been overwhelming. She quickly responded, thanking her friend for checking in. When she got outside, she could already see the first signs of how the incident was changing things in the town. There were small groups of people gathered on street corners, talking in hushed tones. Word had spread quickly, and the conversation was far from over. As Tasha made her way down the street, she could hear bits and pieces of the discussion. It's about time someone stood up to them. She's the mayor's daughter. That's why it's such a big deal. Did you see the officer's face? He knew he messed up. Tasha didn't stop to join the conversations. She knew it would only make things more complicated. She had a mission for the day, to meet with the local civil rights group that her father had been a part of for years. He had asked her to attend the meeting, hoping that the discussion about police accountability and racial justice could continue. He wanted her to be part of it, to use her voice and help guide the conversation in the right direction. As she walked toward the community center, she could feel the eyes of the people around her. Some of them smiled in encouragement, while others looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. There were also a few who looked away, unsure of what to make of it all. Tasha didn't mind. She wasn't doing this for anyone else but herself and the people who needed to be heard. When she arrived at the community center, she was greeted by familiar faces. Her father's colleagues, activists, and community leaders were already gathered, waiting for her. The room was full of energy, a mix of determination and passion. Tasha took a deep breath as she walked in, her presence noticed by everyone in the room. It was clear that yesterday's events had sparked something much larger. Her father stood at the front, nodding to her as she entered. "Glad you could make it," he said with a small smile. His eyes were warm, full of pride, but she could see the concern there as well. This was more than just about her. It was about the town, about the future, about making sure that the wrongs that had been done were addressed. The meeting began with a recap of what had happened the day before. The group discussed the officer's actions and the importance of holding him accountable. But the conversation quickly shifted to the bigger picture. What could be done to make sure that no one else faced the kind of treatment Tasha had endured? The question was one that everyone in the room had been asking for years, but now it felt more urgent than ever. Tasha spoke up for the first time, her voice calm but full of conviction. "This isn't just about one officer," she said. "It's about changing the way our community sees race, sees justice. We can't keep letting this happen." Her words were simple, but they resonated deeply with the group. People nodded, and she could see that her message was getting through. The rest of the meeting was filled with ideas, strategies, and discussions about the steps they could take to create real change. Tasha felt a sense of purpose building inside her. She had stepped into this room as just the mayor's daughter, but now she was part of something bigger. This wasn't just about her. It was about making sure that everyone was treated equally, fairly, and with respect. By the end of the meeting, there was a clear path forward. They had a plan to organize a town-wide rally, a peaceful protest to demand justice and equality. Tasha's heart swelled with pride as she realized how much they could accomplish together. She wasn't sure where the journey would lead, but she knew one thing: she wasn't walking it alone. The next few days passed in a blur. Tasha spent most of her time with her father and the group of community leaders who had gathered to make real change happen. The news of the officers' actions continued to spread, and while there were some who didn't fully understand or agree with what had happened, there were many who supported Tasha. It became clear that the incident had sparked something larger, something that could not be ignored. The community was ready for a shift, and Tasha felt a sense of responsibility like never before. In the days that followed, the group worked tirelessly to organize the rally. It wasn't just about demanding justice for her. It was about standing together as a community to say that this kind of treatment would not be tolerated. The rally would be a peaceful demonstration of unity, a call for fairness, equality, and respect for everyone, regardless of their race or background. Tasha found herself involved in every step of the process. She helped with logistics, reached out to local organizations, and even spoke to a few local businesses, asking for their support. She was amazed at how many people were willing to step forward. Her father's influence played a significant role, but it was clear that this moment had ignited a spark in many others as well. It wasn't just a moment for Tasha. It was a moment for the whole town to come together. The day of the rally arrived, and the energy in the town was electric. People from all walks of life gathered in the town square, holding signs that read "Justice for all" and "Equality now." Tasha could feel the unity in the air, the hope that this was the beginning of something meaningful. She walked through the crowd, exchanging smiles and nods with familiar faces. Her heart swelled with pride as she realized that this wasn't just her fight. It was everyone's fight. The town had come together to demand a change, and together they would be heard. As the rally kicked off, Tasha took the stage alongside her father and other leaders in the community. The crowd cheered, their voices rising in a chorus of support. Her father spoke first, addressing the crowd with his usual calm and authoritative presence. He spoke of the importance of standing up for what is right, of not letting fear or complacency silence the truth. He spoke about the need for reform, not just in the police force, but in the way the town treated its most vulnerable members. Then it was Tasha's turn. She stepped up to the microphone, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. This wasn't just about her. It was about the future. It was about making sure that no one else would face the kind of injustice she had experienced. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she began to speak. "This town is my home," she began, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "I was born here, and I will raise my children here. But for too long, we've allowed fear and prejudice to shape the way we treat each other. This isn't just about one officer's actions. This is about all of us, standing together, demanding that we be treated with the respect and fairness we deserve." Her words were met with a roar of approval, the crowd shouting in agreement. Tasha could feel the energy building, the power of the collective voice surrounding her. "We are more than just the labels that others try to put on us," she continued. "We are human. We are worthy of respect. And together, we will make sure that our voices are heard. We will stand for justice, equality, and love." The crowd erupted in applause, and Tasha felt a sense of hope rise within her. This wasn't just a rally. It was a movement. It was the beginning of a change that was long overdue. As she looked out over the sea of faces, she realized that this was bigger than her. This was bigger than one town. This was about something universal, the fight for fairness, dignity, and equality for all people, no matter where they came from. As the rally continued, more people spoke, sharing their own stories and experiences. There were tears, but there was also laughter and hope. Tasha knew that this was only the beginning, but it was a strong and important first step. She had sparked something that could not be put out. The officer, the pain, the injustice, those things would not define her or her community. What would define them was the strength, the unity, and the courage they had shown in coming together to make a stand for what was right. By the end of the day, Tasha felt a sense of peace settle over her. The rally had been a success, and she knew that change was on the horizon. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. She had stood up for herself, for her family, and for her community. And in doing so, she had inspired others to do the same. As the crowd began to disperse, Tasha looked up at her father, who was standing beside her, a proud smile on his face. "You did good," he said, his voice filled with warmth. Tasha smiled back, her heart full. We did good. And for the first time in a long time, Tasha felt like she was exactly where she needed to be, right at the heart of the change she had always wanted to see.